We'll begin by introducing ourselves and talking a bit about our publishing background. I'll invite you to read the slide yourself about our education and employment background. I worked for over 30 years at the University of Rochester Medical Center. In that environment, there is a lot of pressure to get grants and to publish your research. I have published over 100 articles, book chapters, and so on. We will be talking about a variety of publication approaches and different ways to disseminate your research work. That's enough about me. I'll turn it over to Joseph now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Joseph Hill. And you can see here my educational background. I have a PhD in linguistics from Gallaudet University. I graduated in 2011. And Bob's experience at the University of Rochester is a bit different than my experience, where the University of Rochester has high pressure to produce publications. I've worked at a few different universities. At Gallaudet, there is encouragement to publish, but the expectations for faculty there, which I were used to, is quite different than the expectations for faculty here. So all institutions and universities are not the same in terms of their expectations for publications. My first work experience was at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And there I was in the Department of Special Education Services, which focused primarily on special education. Now, my linguistics background, what I knew from the field previous to the time that I joined the University of North Carolina, was completely different in terms of expectations to publish. So I published 2 books during that time that I was at University of North Carolina, and I didn't realize that I was also expected to be publishing journal articles as well. So that was a bit of a surprise to me. And really, I didn't fully understand their expectations for publications. And as I worked there longer, for other reasons, and there are other stories about that university, but I found that it was a better fit for me to move here to RIT. And here at RIT, I work in the Department of ASLIE. I'm also part of the NTID Research Center on Culture and Language. And so that gives me a good understanding of the research culture here. And at the same time, I have a better understanding of RIT's expectations so that I can ensure that I have a good publishing strategy that fits the expectations here. So in the past 10 years as a faculty member, including the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and at RIT, those 10 years will be informing our presentation today. So here at RIT, as with any university, it's important to know what the expectations are for promotion and tenure. And that information is often available on the university's website. There are often policies that are publicly available that you can review. And if those policies aren't clear or you can't find them, you can always contact the provost or the dean of the university to be able to find out what policies are related to expectations for publications. And academic affairs, of course, would also know the appropriate policies. Here at RIT, these are the policies that we follow. Faculty are expected to publish within their discipline and to do scholarship within their discipline. They're expected to engage in disciplinary, interdisciplinary, or multidisciplinary scholarship. And so, of course, there are several different types of scholarship. Scholarship of discovery, which includes basic research, scholarship of teaching and pedagogy, improving teaching or improving curriculum. That also includes doing basic research and then applying that to the classroom. And there are a number of different ways that scholarship can be synthesized to the classroom. Other research may inform policies or techniques or technology available on campus. That includes scholarship of integration and application, and then scholarship of engagement. So there are several different types of scholarship, and a lot of that depends on your specific discipline. So we won't go into too much detail about this, but I think this is helpful to give us a framework of what you can do and are expected to do here at RIT. Different universities, of course, have different expectations in terms of the number of publications and depending on the rank, whether you're applying for tenure or applying for promotion. Here at NTID, this document is available. This is the NTID Scholarship Guidance document, and it's saved under NTID Academic Affairs. So for a current assistant professor, for example, you could look at this list and see that you're required to have at least 6 peer-reviewed publications or products, which includes presentations, but at least 3 of them do have to be publications. And then now, if you're an associate professor wanting to move up to be a full professor, you can see at the bottom here that you need at least 5 peer-reviewed products, of which at least 3 must be publications. And you can read more using this link, and we will send out these PowerPoint slides to everyone in the audience after the presentation today. Now, you may be wondering what counts as a publication for this consideration, and so we'll talk about that here in the next slide. So this may seem like a long list of different types of publication, and it is. Typically, scholarship focuses primarily on 2 types of publication, which is journal articles and books. Journal articles can include peer-reviewed publications as well as empirical research. It can also include reviews, which means, for example, a literature review, or a systemic review, or a comparative review of different studies, using different criteria for whatever is important for the study. Or can be done through a document search or a word search. The next type of journal article is theoretical, or book review, or editorial. Sometimes journals request editorials from certain researchers who are doing studies in their field. And there are some other types of publications as well, but these are the most typical publications and most typical types of journal articles. The next that we'll talk about is books. So that can be publishing your original work through a book publisher. Or you can also become the editor, where you would be inviting different researchers to contribute to your book. And you may ask different researchers to write several different chapters of your books. You could also write a textbook, a handbook, or an encyclopedia. And so again, it depends on what's typical within your discipline. And then there are other types of publications as well, including conference papers. So if you go to a conference and present your work, then often that can result in a conference paper. And normally people who present get feedback on their presentation and then submit a revised work to a journal. There are also conference proceedings, which could be considered a publication. Now, again, it depends on your discipline and it depends on your department. Some departments count proceedings papers while others don't. So you may want to ask your department chair if you're not sure about that. The next type, of course, is thesis and dissertation, and then you can read the rest of the list here. So now, if we're thinking about tenure and promotion, the most often categories that are considered are these on the left, journal articles and books. These are most important to focus on for tenure and promotion. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do these other types of publications, but again, it depends on your purpose in doing those other types of publications. For conference papers, those are probably a good use of your time. It's a way to get feedback on your work and get your work out there and disseminate your findings. And then a conference paper can also lead to a journal article or a book chapter or a book in and of itself. Conference papers can also help you revise your thoughts and get feedback on the study that you're doing so far. So those can be very valuable. But some of the others, such as blogs or vlogs, again, might be helpful, but it really depends on whether it's worth it. And it may not count as a publication, but again, it may be a way to disseminate your research findings in a way that's concise, to explain what you're doing for your research. And that may help you reach other audiences so that you're not only focusing on research audience who would be consuming proceedings papers and journal articles, but also reach a broader audience. And that may, again, lead people back to more formal publications and academic publications. So use your time wisely and think about how you disseminate your work and your purpose for doing these different types of publications.
I just want to add a few thoughts here. Regarding the word empirical, it means a discovery. It could be quantitative data or qualitative design, or both. It could be mixed method design. Another type that typically shows up in journals is letter to editors, and those are peer reviewed. Also, sometimes a person can take responsibility for editing a special issue of a journal, which I've had experience doing previously. We'll be discussing editing a bit more later on. This is a very busy slide, so I will try and go through it slowly, piece by piece. First, we'll talk about different ways to choose the right journal for publishing your work. I'll start with an example. I recently finished a research study related to cortical levels and the distortion or stability of them in interpreters. So cortisol is a hormone that is affiliated with stress in our systems. We completed that research study and had some very interesting results. So then it came time to try to decide where we wanted to publish. No matter what type of work you're doing, you must have an interested audience. Our cortisol research could potentially be interesting to various peoples. It could be interesting for a biology journal, occupational health journals, journals related to psychological stress, interpreting related journals, and so on. So our team had to think about what journal might be the best decision for us to publish in. So we looked into these various types of journals to see what might best fit our research study. The top level journals are probably those biology journals or science related journals. I'm listening to the interpreter, so there's a pause there. One issue with publishing in a scientific journal was that our methodology was not quite perfect enough. So we decided to drop that idea and not pursue the biology journal. We then looked into various other types of journals and decided to submit to an international interpreting journal. That's an example of how your research work might apply to a variety of different audiences. Suppose someone wants to write about the Titanic. You might want to write about the engineering and structure of the boat, or the success of those people on the boat, or the rescue of those on the ship. Whatever it might be, the point is that your research might be interesting to a variety of audiences, and you just want to make sure that you find the journal that best fits your topic. Back to my example on the cortisol research. Well, and another example. Quite a time ago, I did a lecture on the history of the psychology of deaf people. It was a presentation, a lecture. That was it. But after I did the presentation, I decided that I wanted to publish the lecture, but I didn't really want it to be a top tier formal journal. I really just wanted to disseminate the information from my lecture. So I did look into a variety of journals that might be interested in my lecture on the history of the psychology of deaf people. So the journal I published in wasn't as popular, but my article became very popular. Many PDFs have been downloaded. I've sent many PDFs to folks. So you want to make sure that the journal that you publish in matches your research work at a variety of levels. If you're rejected, don't think that your work is not good enough. It just might be that you're not looking in the right place to publish. Don't give up. There are a variety of places that you can publish information. Yes, Joseph?
Right. And Bob, you mentioned deciding which journal would be the best fit for the publication that you have. And there are a lot of different factors to consider for that. Many journals also expect typed out in English articles, but some journals do also allow submissions in American Sign Language. So there are a few journals that accept submissions through video of ASL. So it depends on your field. If you would be able to submit an article for publication in a journal, it depends on the field whether or not they'd accept an article in ASL. And again, it also depends on the audience that you're trying to reach. If you feel that it's important to reach an ASL using audience, then it may be better to consider one of those journals and consider finding a journal that accepts an ASL video submission and considers it on equal footing as a typed out written manuscript. So there are peer-reviewed ASL video journals as well. So it's important to determine, again, who the audience is of your work, what type of work you're doing, and know that there are similar review processes for both written manuscripts and ASL video submissions out there.
So there may be journals that you submit a video to and they don't have any experience publishing that. It might be a really great idea and the editor might think it's a great idea and want to publish a video article, but they just aren't aware of it yet. So go ahead and ask. It never hurts to ask. There is a system called JANE, Jane. You'll see on the right side of the slide. So if you have a summary of your work or several lines of your research work, you can post that into Jane, and Jane will do a search and provide suggestions of various journals that might be appropriate for you to submit your work for publication. It's a pretty cool system. So once you have that list, you'll then see instructions to the author. All journals have that on their webpage. It doesn't matter the journal, they will have instructions to the author. They will tell you what type of article they want, if it's empirical, if it's essay, whatever it might be. They will include that in the instructions to the author, so read that carefully. If you're unsure if your work would actually match that journal and the audience, go ahead and contact the editor. Now, don't send your full article, just give a brief summary about what your article is about, and the editor will let you know if it would be worth submitting it for potential publication in their journal. Another thing is if a journal is indexed. Then that depends on a certain system that people will use to find your article. People in the educational field want an indexed article in ERIC, E-R-I-C, the specific database. So the final point here is the impact factor. This would be how much the article is cited by other people, and the impact factor can be less than 1 or very high numbers. For example, the New England Journal of Medicine is a very popular high-level journal, and the impact factor is 75 for that journal. Most journals have an impact factor of 3 or 2 or around about there or below. The American Annals of the Deaf has an impact factor between 1.5 or less. So the Deaf Studies digital journal has an impact factor of 1.6. At RIT, the impact factor is not so critical, but it is important to consider and think about when you are looking for where you want to publish your research. Another comment about predatory journal. That's a journal of really bad people. They're going to steal your money. They're going to force you to pay to publish your article, and that's not good. Our RIT librarian, who is Joan Natural, she has an excellent PowerPoint related to predatory journals and how to avoid those. If you receive an email from a journal basically begging you to submit an article to their journal, be very careful and check into that a little bit more because it could be a predatory journal. And you can contact Joan for more information about that. This slide is a bit of my opinion about how to write a journal manuscript. From my experience, both reviewing articles and mentoring those who write articles for publication. I recommend you start with a list, a bullet point list of important points you want to cover. I suggest you don't just start writing a narrative, but instead start with a list of bullet points. Then you will analyze each of those points on your list to see if you really need to include it in your manuscript or not. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see an example of an article that I will send to you. And this article explains my approach for writing a manuscript. I collected bullet points from people, and each bullet point was on an index card. So then I laid out all of my index cards. It might be 30 index cards. And then I tend to rearrange them into the best logical order. I will say it's similar to building a tree. So the index cards will have the key points, which you can picture as like the trunk. And then you have the large branches protruding out of the trunk. And then the lesser important points are like the smaller branches that grow out of those larger branches. And when you rearrange the index cards into a good logical order, that's when you can begin writing. And the writing is like the leaves. I first, before I can picture the leaves or get to the leaves, I first have to build the logical story, and then I can add the leaves to the tree. So I'm happy to share this article. It goes more in depth about my process. But a final resource, the APA publication manual, gives examples about how to write clearly for articles. I encourage you to have that publication manual for reference. I'm happy to use my office's budget to purchase you a copy of the book if you do not have one. My office also has a contract with an editor who can help with manuscript writing. So if you would like to take advantage of that service, contact me. So once you submit your article to the journal for review, you'll get feedback. You might be asked to revise your manuscript and resubmit, which is okay. You are almost never accepted for publication the first time without revisions. You are usually provided with feedback from 2 to 3 reviewers. And sometimes, maybe often, those reviewers' comments and their feedback conflicts with each other's. If you get clear feedback, go ahead and make the revisions following the reviewer's request, and then submit it for a publication. If there is some disagreement between reviewers' comments, then you'll have to decide which ones you want to follow, which comments you want to take into consideration, and then you will explain in your revision why you chose to keep or not keep different reviewers' comments and feedback, and then resubmit for your publication. You can always contact the editor for advice if you're unclear. Once it's accepted for publication, it will be sent to proofs, and you will get an example or sample of what the article will look like after publication. You'll then get a few days to review the proofs, and your work is not done at that point. Proofs usually include questions from the journal, maybe asking about citations and where the actual original article is, or asking for additions or other such things like that. So you may still have more work to do in those 2 to 3 days' time that you're reviewing the proofs.
So far we've been primarily talking about manuscript writing. And I made a comment about video submissions in American Sign Language. And it is a similar process. Typically, it includes video editing. And so that also means that if it follows the same process, so it is intensive work to create an ASL submission, an ASL manuscript. It requires you to clearly lay out your thoughts, as Bob suggested, and make sure that all of your points are in order. That is a key part of video submissions. And then, of course, you have to do the actual video work, which can be quite time consuming if you have to record and then re-record. And that process in and of itself of describing your work is not easy. And it's not just that, you also have to make sure that you have lighting, appropriate clothing, a good background. You'll want to have someone else review your work before you submit it to a journal to review for both the content and the appearance of the presentation. So there are a lot of details to consider for video submissions as well.
One more comment about that. There are also open access costs. Many journals, good, respectable journals today, will offer the opportunity for you all to, or for you as a researcher to pay money for this to be open access. That means that anyone who finds the article, not just subscribers to the specific platform, but anyone who finds the article can access it without a cost. Often that does cost a lot of money. I'm talking several $1,000s for you to do an open source publication. So I encourage you, when you write a grant, that you include an open source or a publication fee. Or if you are asked to pay an open access fee by a journal and you don't have the funding to do so, contact me and my office can pay for that fee, if it is a respectable and not a predatory journal.
Okay, so now I'll talk a bit more about writing books, book publications. So of course you have to think about your field and whether your field encourages book publications or not. And so you'll want to think about creating a plan to write a book, because writing a book is very time intensive. So if your field does not require book publications, or your department doesn't require book publications, then you may want to prioritize journals and you won't have to publish a book. But again, it depends a lot on the type of impact that you want to make with your work as well. Journals are very good and important. They're easy to share with other people. You can always save a copy, share them as needed. They can be cited by others. But again, you also want to think about the audience and who you'll reach with a certain type of publication. If you publish a book that allows a wider audience to access your book, where a journal may have a more limited option, even if it's open access, you're still reaching primarily academics. And many journals these days still have paywalls, meaning that they're not readily accessible to anyone without an academic license. So that is something to consider, that books may have a wider impact. So let's say that you decide to publish a book. It may make a larger impact and it may be required for your field. So you want to publish a book. Now, if you're trying to think of which publishing company to use, again, it depends on your field. You may go to conferences regularly, and it may be a good idea to see who shows up in the book exhibits at the conferences that you attend. Take a look at the books that are there and who published them, and see who else in the field is doing similar work to you. That's one option. Or you can also use the work that you cite in your research and see which publishing companies other people doing similar work have used. And those may indicate publishers who will support your work. So it's not quite as simple as just sending your entire book to a publisher and going from there. Of course, there are a few more steps to it. And often you can find more information on the publisher's website. You can download a list of expectations for what they expect in terms of names, titles, abstracts for the book, abstracts for each book chapter. And then they will also want marketing information. So that means that you'll have to do some homework. You'll have to say, my book is studying this topic, and you'll have to look for other books that are on a similar topic, that have similar content to yours or similar ideas. That's a way for the publishing company to decide if your book is worth publishing. If there's a book out there that's too similar, they may hesitate to publish it. You also want to emphasize the importance of your work and explain to them why it is important that your book is published. And then hopefully from there, the publisher will decide to accept your book and publish it under their company. From there, the publisher will send it to book reviewers who will decide whether or not to publish your book. So you may want to publish under a more prestigious publisher, which is a great idea, but do keep in mind the book price, especially for more prestigious publishers. If your book is priced such that most people can't afford it, then you're not really reaching as wide an audience as you could be. And I'll explain more about that in a later slide. But it's important here, I want to emphasize that the publisher you use, you want to make sure that you're not just choosing them because they're the most prestigious, but think about making the most impact. And so make sure that you weigh all of these different factors when you decide which publishing company to use. And again, keep your intended audience in mind the entire time. If your audience is primarily researchers, you may want to look at certain research publishers. If your audience is more related to education, pedagogy, or teaching, you may want to look at other publishers that publish more in those areas. You may also have to translate your academic language, the academic writing that you've done, to be more accessible to lay people and the general public. So you'll have to make a lot of decisions about what's appropriate for your work and what's appropriate for your intended audience. You also have to think about the time and energy required to write a book. Of course, it does take a lot longer compared to a journal article. There are a lot more pages in a book than there are in a journal article. So think about the time that you're investing if you decide to publish a book. It's also important to ask if your book could be peer-reviewed. I personally didn't realize that that was an option until I worked at the University of North Carolina. I had already published 2 books at that point. And for me, just starting at my first during my first 2 years as an assistant professor, I had 2 books published. I thought that was very impressive. But then my department chair asked me if I had them peer reviewed, and unfortunately I hadn't. So, up until that point, I really hadn't thought about that as an option. So you can ask publishers if they would be willing to go through a peer review process for your book, and that's considered a peer-reviewed book publication. Once you start that process, it is important to maintain a good relationship with the editors and stay in regular contact with them so that they can help you refine your work. And after that point, it will be easier if you can meet with the publishers so that they know who you are and they know the type of work that you're doing, and you can develop a good relationship with them. Now, there are a lot of different publishers out there, and it really depends on what field you're in. But these are some publishers that I've worked with personally: Gallaudet University Press, Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, Routledge, Wiley Blackwell, and Sage Publications. And I haven't necessarily worked with them for book publications, but I have worked with them for invited book chapters that I submitted as part of a larger collection of work. So there are a few different types of book publications that you can do. You can publish, of course, an original work. I'm sure that most of you know my work on Black ASL as part of a team of researchers. The PI of that project already had a good relationship with Gallaudet University Press. They had a long-time relationship and knew each other well. And I joined their project as a PhD student, so I was able to learn more about the dynamics of Gallaudet University Press and the publishing process. So I was involved in the book proposal process and the publishing process. And that took about 2 years of work from start to finish, from the book proposal to the final publication of the book. That also included producing a DVD to go alongside the book. So that, of course, is a lot of work, not only writing a book, chapter by chapter, passing it around, getting feedback on every single chapter, submitting it to the editors, and then, of course, getting their feedback, making revisions to it, and then finalizing each chapter. And that process took about 9 months for the final product until it was published. And that's about a normal timeline. The other book here is Language Attitudes. And this is my original work as my dissertation and as my thesis. So normally for publishers, it's appropriate to send them an abstract and ask if they would be interested in a full proposal, and then submit a proposal from there. After you submit the proposal, you can make edits to change the format. So for me, I had to basically undissertize my dissertation to translate it so that it was appropriate in a book format. And at that time, that was a unique situation, because at that time they were still under Gallaudet University Press, and they were supposed to have a book published soon, but something happened during that process. And they asked if they might be able to use my work because they were familiar with my work. And I thought I would have a year or two to be able to finish the book, and they told me I would only have 3 months. So that was a very stressful experience, but it did result in my original work and my dissertation being published. And I realized after it was published, the price of the book, as I mentioned earlier, Language Attitudes costs $85. So when I realized that, I wondered how people would be able to afford that when the book is so expensive, especially compared to other books. The other book on Black ASL was $65, and it included a DVD. So it really is almost 2 books in one. But then Language Attitudes cost even more. And now Gallaudet University Press is under new management, and so they have different ways of promoting their work and marketing their works. And that's just one thing that I didn't realize when I was working with them, was the final price that my book would be. And so that limits the impact to different audiences. The next type of book publication that I'll talk about is an edited volume. Now, the difference between an original work and an edited book is that an edited book, for example, does still require the same type of book proposal. If I have an idea for a book, I would submit the proposal to a publisher. And then I would also have an idea of different other individuals I would want to invite to make contributions to the book. And each of those individuals would be listed in the proposal. So then the big challenge for this is managing people. So making sure that everyone sends their work on time, that everyone's work matches my expectations, that they do their revisions based on feedback as appropriate. And so in some ways that's more stressful to be the editor of an edited volume than it is to just write an original work on yourself. For original work, you're only managing yourself, maybe one or two co-authors. But for an edited volume, you might have 10, 20, or even 25 different people involved, which can be a lot. But if you feel that it's worth it to do that work, if you feel that it's important to include different people in your work, and you really want to compile them into one edited volume, then that can absolutely be worth it. But for this type of work, I feel that it is better to do that work after you have already gotten tenure, not as an assistant professor, in my opinion. And again, you want to think about the impact of your research and your publications during your pre-tenure track and post-tenure track years. The other experience that I've had is writing a textbook, and this is a sign language linguistics textbook that I published within my field. I was invited to be a part of this project with two other co-authors. And my experience was primarily focused on sociolinguistics, where they had other areas of focus. And so it was a good fit for me to be part of their team. Now, a textbook is a really different experience for me. Compared to other types of academic books, I knew what to expect. I knew how to write for different audiences. I knew how to express my work appropriately for different types of audiences. But here, of course, the audience is students. Even if it's grad students, they are still students. And so it's important to think about how to make your writing interesting, and also how to make my voice and content, all of the different concepts represented visually. There are a lot more pictures in a textbook as well. And at the same time, the textbook is not only for people in the ASL field, but they're also in broader linguistics fields. And often sign languages are overlooked in linguistics fields in general. So we felt it was very important for sign language linguistics to be included in other general linguistics courses. So that was a huge challenge. And it was a very challenging experience, but a rich experience for me.
Another thing about publishing a book, another option is self-publishing. For this book, we decided to self-publish because we knew our audience. We didn't need feedback from a company. We knew that we wanted to send this to interpreter training programs and interpreters. So we decided to use the self-publishing method. We decided to contract and collaborate with Kindle Direct Publishing, and it is available on Amazon. We wrote the book. It's not peer reviewed. We hired a graphic designer to help us with the illustrations and, with the cover, the look of the cover. We also did recruit a few peers in the interpreting field to write some comments for the introduction of the book and for the back cover. We did the marketing ourselves because we, again, knew our target audience and who we wanted to reach out to.
Yeah, and to add that too, you mentioned that you didn't need to market because you knew the audience. Another important thing to decide is if you self-publish, you want to know ahead of time that you are the person responsible for marketing. And so I think some people who self-publish don't realize all of the work that it takes, all of the emails and traveling and networking that it takes. So it does end up being a bit more work. Having a publishing company that will market your book and advertise it for you is nice, but it can also be a pain. Some things as simple as doing the book cover design, for example. I submitted my idea for the book cover design and they said, no, it would have to be something else. And so we had a bit of a scuffle over what the book cover design would look like. And so there are pros and cons to self-publishing or publishing with a publishing company. So now we've talked about journal articles and books. And now let's say that you've gotten things published, you have them on your CV, and you are ready to send them for appraisal. And you're also ready to include them in your reports. It's also important to think about how other people will know what work you have published. So for you as a researcher, how do you establish your research presence? How do other people know the type of work that you're doing? So I showed in some previous slides some other ways of disseminating your work through articles such as newsletters or blogs or vlogs. Those are all options of things that you can do. They don't necessarily count as a publication, but in a way you are still communicating with other audiences, and maybe more diverse audiences than academic audiences. And you may find other people may find your work and find it interesting and then do more reading on your actual academic publications. So now I'll talk for a few minutes about the digital world. So you can use social media, for example, to establish your presence. We all knew Facebook. I'm sure some of you are still using Facebook. I know some people, of course, we all have personal accounts, but some people also have professional accounts on Facebook to share their work. Same thing is also true for Twitter. I often see researchers who have a publication, and especially if it's open access, they'll share it on Twitter. And that way it reaches a lot of people through their Twitter followers and their Twitter social media accounts. And that can also increase the number of citations that your work gets. And then, of course, a more professional social media site is LinkedIn. So that's another option. And those are 3 different ways to promote your work through social media platforms. Another system is called ORCID, and that's a government-run system. ORCID gives you an account with a specific ORCID ID number. And if you can feed publications, or it can also automatically find your publications. And all of your publications will be connected to your ID number. And then your ID number can be used, for example, for applications, for other websites and portfolios, and anywhere else. You can always include your ID number, and that can be linked back to your ORCID page where you can where anyone can find all of your publications. And so that's a good way to manage your publications. And other researchers can easily find all of your publications using your ID number. And then there are 2 different publication websites, not necessarily publication websites, but they are both websites where people can look up the publications that you've done. So one of them is called Web of Science. And typically that only includes peer-reviewed work. So journal articles, proceedings, and so on. And you may have hundreds of publications, but only 45 peer-reviewed publications, for example. And so those would show up on Web of Science. So anyone could search for your name, and then they can see all of your publications, as well as how many times they've been cited and some other information about them. Google Scholar is very similar, but they do include a few more types of publications, such as presentations and book chapters. And I'll show you some examples of those in a moment. The last 2 I have here are ways that you can create your own website to market yourself as a researcher. You can use WordPress. for example, or you can also use Google Sites. Personally, I use Google Sites because I already have a Google account. And so it's easy for me to just create an affiliated Google site. I can manage all of my information, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment too. So this is an example from Web of Science. I typed in Bob's name, and this is what came up. You can see here the organizations that he's been part of, as well as his publications. And then you can also see the reference or the number of citations here for each of his different references. And you can see the H index based on the number of citations and publications that he's gotten. So if you want to include this in your proposal, you can, and this is a great resource for that. And then this also shows Bob's publications over the years. This is my Google Scholar portfolio. And if you remember, I mentioned that Web of Science only collects peer-reviewed works, where Google Scholar collects almost everything. So you can see the difference here. And of course, that does impact the H factor. The H factor would be higher in this case than the Web of Science. H factor might be a little bit lower because it's only including peer-reviewed publications. But that's fine. I'm not worried about it. I'm still pretty early in my career. So it is still important to review all of these publications and ensure that they are correctly cited, that they are correctly credited to you, because sometimes Google Scholar does accidentally find other people's work and attribute it to you. So it's important to review this periodically and ensure that everything on it is correct. And then finally, this is my website. As I mentioned, I use Google Sites, and this helps me promote my work. I do have social media accounts, including Facebook and Twitter, that I also use to promote my work. And I also have an ORCID ID, but I decided that I wanted to include everything in one website that I controlled to make it very easy for people to find my work. When I created my website, people would often look at my name and then find me under the university, under publications, in a number of different ways, but they were scattered over different places. They weren't all in one place. So I decided to create this website so that everything is all in one place. It's easy to find, and it's easy to link out to other places to find more information. So all of my publications, all of my interviews, everything that I've done is stored here on the website. And this also helps me increase my online presence as a researcher. And so you may want to think about doing the same thing for yourself. So now I will open it up for questions and answers. All right, I see one question that was sent to me privately. And part of this question is for Bob. The question is about free editing services from your office. Is that limited to tenure track people only? Or is it only limited to sponsored research? Or is it available for any faculty at any rank?
This is something that we just began a few months ago, and we have a limited contract with our editor, Susan Rizzo. Some of you may remember her. She worked in the Center on Culture and Language. But we're talking with her to see how we can move forward, but our priority is for her to work with grant applicants and secondarily to help with peer-reviewed journal articles. I am open to assisting anyone who would like help from these editorial services. But again, my priority is grants and peer-reviewed journals. So far, because it's a new service we're offering, we don't have a lot of demand for it, but we hope that more people will be taking advantage. But we do have a limited amount of funds within this current contract, but we can talk about extending that if needed. So if anyone is interested in taking advantage of those services, just reach out and contact me.
This is another question for me. This is a question to explain more about ASL publications. So for example, the DSDJ, which is the Deaf Studies Digital Journal. For me, I actually don't have a lot of experience with the Deaf Studies Digital Journal, but I have more experience with the JSLLL, which is the Journal of Sign Languages. I was formerly an editor with that journal, and then I stepped down. And the process is very similar for other journals. We ask people to submit their work, and often people did submit videos. They do accept video submissions. And then the editor would have 3 people focusing on different areas of the video to see if they met each of those different areas, language, content, and so on. And then from there, the editor would make those assignments to reviewers. And then people on the editorial board, which is similar to other journals. Most journals typically will have an editorial board. Those are experts who determine whether to accept your work for review. So they would review it and give feedback based on their criteria. After reviewing based on those criteria, it would then be sent to the editor. And the editor would look over which would be considered the most important, and then send it for any other feedback. So the feedback may be to change a few small things, such as the content, not only the content, but also the appearance, a person's clothing, background, lighting, everything related to the presentation of the video itself. We would ask them to make changes and then resubmit. So there would often be a bit of back and forth with that process. So that was my experience with ASL publications with that journal. Once a video was accepted for final publication, then it would be published online and it would be available for anyone to see. And it would also be shared on social media.
In the beginning, Erin Kelstone made a point about the performing arts field and how RIT is emphasizing the need for more performing arts products and scholarship. Let me look here again at what his actual comment was. So his question is, do we need to work on developing guidelines to help faculty meet scholarship that fits these disciplinary areas? And if so, who can help us with this process? This is not my field of or my area of expertise, so.
Sure. I do know that RIT has people who are strongly involved in arts. And so they may have some guidelines that may be available for their faculty within their department, but may also apply to our arts departments here. So I would be curious to see what type of works they consider to be acceptable within their field. And it may be a good idea to ask over there, the College of Art and Design, to see what they do. And that may also be a good question for academic affairs as well. They may be able to help and give more advice about that. I'm not really familiar with that field either, with arts or performing arts. So I think that would be a good question for people over in academic affairs.
Lisa Elliott asked, how do you structure your time so that writing becomes a part of your routine? I will tell you that when I worked at the University of Rochester, one topic was always have an article to work on, always have an article under review, and always have an article in progress. So that is a lot of pressure. And a lot of my time was spent writing at work at my desk. If I had no meetings one day, I would block out my full day's schedule and let everyone know that I would be writing that day. You had to, because you couldn't just write 1 hour here, 1 hour there. you had to block out a larger chunk of time in order to complete your writing. Sometimes it's on the weekends and nights. Joseph, what about you?
Sure. Honestly, I'm still struggling with this a little bit and getting into a good writing routine. It seems like I'm still getting getting enough publications, so I think whatever I'm doing is working. But let's see. I think for me to manage writing, I try to write consistently. And I also created an individual development plan for myself. And so that helps me structure my time in different areas, including teaching, research, and service. And so I have the different parts of my time laid out. I also have deadlines. So I know that if there's a submission due at a certain time, I can work backwards so that I can plan my time and schedule my time accordingly to get it submitted on time. I also join writing retreats whenever I can. I know that the Writing Center at RIT often offers writing retreats, especially on the weekends, or sometimes for 2 or 3 days at a time. So I participate in those whenever I can, because that gets me out of my office and gives me a chance to follow their time and, their rigorous schedules for writing, whatever it is. And that could even be just organizing my notes if I'm not ready to actually start writing, or organizing my references, making sure that my outline is all set. And then I can do the actual writing itself. But it's helpful to do writing retreats to get in the habit of writing and to set strict times for me to be writing or working on manuscripts. I forget the full title of it, but it's the National Faculty Diversity Organization. And they also offer periodic 2 weeks of writing accountability groups. And so if you join one of their writing accountability groups, it lasts for 2 weeks. And you have to report to them on the time that you spend writing during that time. And that way, that other people are monitoring your work, and you're monitoring other people's work, and we're keeping ourselves accountable. And that helps me keep going. So, or one other thing is to also create a writing group. And again, that would be an on-campus group of colleagues. You can meet via Zoom to keep each other accountable and to work together. And you could even have just one writing partner that you work with. Those are all some tips and a few different ways to help with creating writing and creating publications.
A new question is, Joseph, do you get royalties for your books? I do, Bob. I do from Amazon. The book that's on Amazon, I do. Joseph?
No, I do not get royalties from book chapters that I've submitted in my experience. However, for full published books, I do, such as Language Attitudes and the Black ASL Project book. Of course, it depends on how many people are involved in writing. So for the Black ASL Project, there were 4 co-authors. So the royalties are split in 4 ways between all of us. And so it's a little bit less than it might be if I was the sole publisher, but that's fine. For my Language Attitudes book, again, because of the price of the book, it does not sell a lot. And so my royalties are fairly small from it. But yes, I do, for books that I have published, I do get royalties for them, but I typically get them quarterly. And for book chapters, I typically do not.
Another question here. Matt Lynn asked, are there specific kinds of scholarship that you think NTID faculty are overlooking and could accomplish relatively easily if they knew about it?
Let's see. I think that I know that people involved in academic affairs, as part of my responsibility as Associate Dean for Faculty Retention and Recruitment, in my experience, for us, the question is more of the 5 categories. whether something fits those 5 categories and whether that's something RIT should support. So if it's not one of those categories, then we would meet to discuss it in more detail. If we recognize a type of research that's overlooked, that's not part of those 5 categories, then we would want to discuss whether we could easily recognize that work. Yeah.
I do have a little bit of experience at NTID, seeing that faculty seem to be afraid of journals or publishing. Some faculty think that journals don't cover their fields or fit their fields, but really I disagree. I want to encourage faculty to not be afraid of trying to publish in a journal. Also, Michael Schuyler responded to Matt and said, I am the current book review editor for the American Annals of the Deaf. And he's helped a number of RIT NTID faculty get their reviews published. So contact Michael if you're interested in getting some assistance from him.
Yeah, and I can follow up with the different types of publications as well. I do think that we need some clarifications on what counts for each of those different types of publication. I think that would help to have more examples of what those categories look like. So for me, based on my experience, I can look back and based on my PhD education, that helps me categorize publications into one of those 5 categories. But for a newer faculty, they may not realize that their work fits into one of those categories. And so that is a topic of ongoing discussion. And I think that professional development would be helpful so that people know where their research fits. I think that would definitely help with productivity. And thank you to Sarah Sarche for sharing the link for the Faculty Diversity Organization, the NCFDD. We do all have free membership being here at RIT. So I encourage all of you to check out that resource. They have really great resources for faculty and especially for writing support. They have a lot of different tips, motivational messages. And again, those accountability activities and accountability groups are very helpful to keep writing consistently.
Sarah is asking a couple of questions. So you submit an article and it's rare that it's accepted the first time without revisions. So sometimes you get back just a little bit of feedback, not much. It's also my experience that researchers want to prove these variables. Reviewers always have something to add. They always have something to suggest. Often it's easy to satisfy the reviewer's requests, but they will almost always ask for some type of revision.
Yes, and then from the same person, Sarah, again, I've seen on social media that authors struggle with articles being behind the paywall that may be $40 or $50. And so instead, people will contact the author directly and in the hopes that the author will send you their work. And yes, I have experienced people who were not able to find my work because of a paywall or because they didn't have institutional membership. And they've contacted me to ask for a copy of the article. And often I do give that to them because, again, I want them to have access to my work. I care about my work. I want to share it with other people. It's an honor to be contacted.
And it's an honor, yes.
Yes, absolutely. And often people contact me asking for a copy of my work. And most of the time I say that that's fine and I send it to them. I haven't had a situation where I've heard of someone being redirected to go pay for the paywall. Now, there are also some cases where you may have a final draft that's unpublished, and often that may be posted as the final draft before submitted for final publication. Many authors do post that on their website or under their research accounts. So, for example, at academia.edu or at other websites as well, if there's a copy ready to download and share with others.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.